Hello, and thank you for joining us for the TAA webinar, Bringing Textbooks to Life, Strategies for Improving Student Engagement, presented by Michael Greer. Michael Greer is an educator and an editor who has been working in higher education for over 20 years. He has conducted a number of usability studies on college textbooks, published on textbook design and usability, and studied the ways in which students read and use textbooks. He worked as a development editor at Pearson for 15 years before starting his own company, Development by Design. Michael teaches online courses in editing and publishing at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock and is an editor for the journal Research in Online Literacy Education. Michael is a frequent contributor to the Beyond the Book podcast series, where you can hear more of his thoughts on students, learning, and the design of educational materials. Hello, Michael. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thanks so much. Hi, everybody. So hi, everybody, and thank you so much. Really, it's exciting to have so many people that want to show up on a busy Thursday to talk about strategies for bringing textbooks to life. So I'm really excited to be here and excited to share some ideas with you. And to get started, I want to tell a little story that gives you some background of how I came to be thinking about these kinds of things. About 10 years ago, I was a full-time development editor working with Pearson Higher Ed, and I was assigned the project of working with an author team to develop a brand new first edition handbook from scratch. Now, I don't know if you know much about the handbook market, but it's one of the most competitive textbook markets there is. That, you know, the installed user base for handbooks is about 3.5 million. It's very competitive. There's a lot of students. It's a book that's used in pretty much every first-year writing course in the country, and it's a very competitive market. So in a way, we were crazy to try to start a new first edition in 2006, 2007, and there was a lot of pressure, and we knew we had to do something different and something new and something innovative. But we had two secret weapons for this process. The first of these you can see by the image on this screen, Dorling Kindersley, DK. I don't know if you're familiar with that imprint. Many of you, if you have children, you probably are. DK is famous for travel books, cookbooks, the Eyewitness series. They're a really well-known imprint. At that time, DK was part of Pearson. DK is now spun off and they're part of Penguin Random House. But at the time, we were one and the same company, so I got to partner with them, and I got to work with a fellow named Stuart Jackman, who was one of the founders of the sort of DK design approach. And what is unique and distinctive about the DK design approach is this. This is a quote from their company website. It says, "DK brings unrivaled clarity to a wide range of topics with a unique combination of words and pictures, put together to spectacular effect." They're known for their visual presentation, and for many years their company tagline was, "We show you what others only tell you." So working with Stuart and with DK really prompted me to start thinking visually and to question and challenge myself and to challenge the author team to think about, how can a writing textbook be more visual, right? What does a comma splice even look like anyway, right? How do you draw a picture of grammar? Interesting kinds of questions. So we started thinking visually. The second sort of secret ingredient that we had was usability testing. We knew early on that we wanted to get feedback from students, not just from teachers. And so we actually commissioned a fellow named Theron Howard, who is the director of the Clemson University Usability Testing Lab. And we worked with Theron to design and perform about 22 hours of video user testing one-on-one with real college students. And so what we did was, working with Theron, we conducted a series of tests to see how students performed tasks using what was at that time the market-leading handbook. Our handbook wasn't written yet, but what we wanted to do was, we wanted to perform a test to learn what was working and what was not working in the currently market-leading handbook at that time. So we worked with a group of writing faculty, we designed these tests, and we made sure that we were asking students authentic questions about things that they would normally use their handbook for. So for example, we would give them messy sentences and they would have to correct those sentence errors and fix the comma splices. We would give them source citations and they would have to format them properly in MLA style and so forth. So they were very authentic tasks. We videotaped them, watched them, talked to them about their experiences. And the conclusion that we came to, sadly, was that the market-leading handbook was, for all practical purposes, unusable. And what was worse, not only could students not do what we asked them to do with the handbook, they didn't realize it. They thought they had done fine. We asked them, how was your experience? Could you find what you needed? Oh yeah, it was great. Great book. Loved it. I found exactly what I needed. I feel really confident that I got the answer right. And they didn't. So we started wondering, uh-oh, what's going wrong here? And the first conclusion that we came to in this process won't surprise any of you if you're textbook authors and work in the field. Most textbooks are designed for faculty, not for students. I mean, the whole faculty process is really baked into the way we develop handbooks, the peer review process, the development process, the adoption process. For good reason, faculty are the decision makers, so we design textbooks for faculty, not for students. But we realized there's a real disconnect here because the students who were using the handbook did not have the prior knowledge. They didn't have the background, and so they were unable to navigate to the correct pages in the handbook. They simply looked at the wrong example. They corrected a comma splice looking at the wrong page. So we realized we faced a pretty big challenge, and we set about to design a handbook that actually worked for students. And we did a series of follow-up tests where we took our material in prototype form and went back to the students and tested it with them and started feeling like we had figured some things out, and we're actually designing a handbook that might be a little more usable for them. And we ended up kind of settling on 3 design strategies, and I'll show you examples of pages from the book that exemplify those strategies. Here's the first one. This is a 2-page spread on audience, and imagine the gutter. This was a spiral-bound book, gutter going down the center, left page 20 on the left and page 21 on the right. Our first philosophy and our first design decision was we are going to design the entire book as a series of 2-page spreads. Because what we saw in those videos when the students were struggling was they flipped. They flipped pages a lot. They were looking for stuff really fast, flipping pages. And the traditional handbook design would have A heads in the middle of the page, and then the content would run onto the next page and flip over to the page flip. And so it was very hard to find things at a glance. So we said, okay, it's obvious we need to design things better to find things at a glance. So we did everything in 2-page spreads. And even more than that, we designed each column. You notice each column of text stops, and there's white space, for example, on that short column on the left. If the column ends, the column ends. We didn't try to squeeze every inch of real estate. This, of course, made the publisher a little crazy because textbook publishers like to use every square inch of space. And we said, no, white space is really important. But we designed the book in these series of spreads and really started thinking of the spread, the page spread, as a unit of meaning for students. The second thing we did was we organized content in what we called layers. So you can see a 2-layer example. On the left, we have this page that is an overview of the 4 main uses of commas. On the right, there's a deeper page that goes more in depth into comma use number 3. So what we learned was that some students are grazers, they skim along the top. Some students are deep divers, they start at the beginning and read the whole page. So we decided we need to be able to support both of those kinds of readers, the linear people and the nonlinear people. So we did this layered approach, which we were kind of thinking like a website. How is a website designed? And so we tried to model that in this sort of layered approach where you could skim or you could dive deep. And then the third lesson was this whole idea of patterns. We realized that students were trying to match patterns. So here's an example of a visual pattern page. This is the part of the book where we're trying to teach students proper format for MLA documentation style. You know how much fun that is. It's a real struggle. There's an incredible amount of detail. So we did these pattern pages to really try to show them the big picture, to help them see the forest for the trees. So right there, smack in the middle of the page in big print, author's name, period. Title of book, italicized, period. So they could, if nothing else, they focus on that big green example in the middle of the page, and they begin to realize, oh, this is not random. There's a pattern. So those were really, the first inklings we got of what it might entail to try to design a more usable handbook or a more usable textbook for students. And it was that experience of working on the project that really started me down the road of rethinking a lot of my own assumptions about student learning and about textbook design. And that story is what led me to be talking to you about these kinds of things today. So that's a little bit of how I got interested in this topic and what sort of motivated my own journey into this learning. Now, at this point, I want to just stop and summarize 2 key lessons that I really draw from the DK handbook experience that I want to extend a little further in the rest of the presentation. The first lesson is how we think about design. As it says here, design is not simply a matter of adding visuals. Design is a way of thinking about the deep structure of your content at every level, book, chapter, unit, and page. Stuart used to say, I'm not an interior decorator, I'm an architect. I will help you design the experience for your student. And he really got me thinking about design more in terms of what you might call information architecture or information design, the deep structure, not just, you know, the curtains on the windows or something at the end. It's not just window dressing. It's not just making it look pretty. It's really thinking about the overall deep structure of the content. So I sort of changed my definition of design. The second key lesson is about interactivity. Interactivity is a word that I think, frankly, gets used and abused and misused a lot. And what I learned from this process and what I want to emphasize today when we talk about interactivity is it's not always about videos and multimedia. It's not about clicks and blang. Interactivity is about engaging the student mind to make the experience mentally and cognitively interactive. Mouse clicks sometimes are not particularly interactive. And of course, the example that I used here is a print book. And we thought we were doing things and trying to do things that were interactive on a print page. So interactivity doesn't necessarily equate with digital. Interactivity means engaging the mind. So those are two of my takeaways from that kind of DK experience. So let me pause here and kind of preview where we're going to go in the rest of the session. So in the rest of the session, I'd really like to share 3 strategies that you can apply yourselves to the process of writing or revising a textbook. Now, I don't necessarily claim that these are particularly revolutionary or particularly new, but they're practical, they're useful, and they're supported by a whole lot of recent research in the field of learning and cognitive psychology. These are strategies that you can take with you and apply to your own work. You can use them incrementally to make revisions to an existing text, or you can use them more holistically and apply these strategies and principles to the development process if you're starting a new book, or if you just have a book that's just an idea. Some of these strategies might help you think about how to outline and design and develop, you know, the framework for that. So we're going to start with a brief detour into the world of learning science to just briefly touch on some key concepts from that, and then look at these 3 principles: backward design, modularity, and multimedia, and then conclude with a little discussion of mobile and the fact that students increasingly want to use their mobile phones and mobile devices to access their course materials. Okay, so let's then start into the first topic, which is this learning science thing. And this is a noun, not a verb. I think some people might look at this and go, oh, he's going to talk about how to learn about science. Learning science as a noun. Learning science is really, as I use the term, a shorthand term that refers to work in a number of related disciplines, including cognitive psychologists who study the mechanics of learning, neuroscientists and biologists who research brain science, and learning-related fields like emotion and motivation. Now, happily for us, much of this research has been synthesized and explained for non-specialists thanks to the works of authors like those books that are pictured here. Now, what I found is that if you look at these books and some others, there are a number of learning principles that readily translate into higher education classroom and textbook design. Now, I put together a short annotated bibliography of a few of these titles, and there's a handout that will be shared with you later, kind of a takeaway that has some further information, so you don't need to scribble all this stuff down. You can find that stuff later if you're interested in reading further. But what's nice is there are a lot of really accessible books that you don't have to be a neurophysiologist to understand some of the lessons of brain science and of this kind of learning. So based on what I've been reading over the last few years in learning science, one of the first things that I have discovered, and this takes us back to the struggle that the students had with the handbook, one of the first things that I discovered is that learning is frankly misunderstood, and that the dominant models of pedagogy in the university and in the textbook world to this day, those dominant models of pedagogy assume that learning is a process of absorbing knowledge. Now, the picture on the screen here is my attempt to visualize these dominant models, the print book and the lecture hall. And I think there have been a lot of debates lately about lectures. I know there's been a lot of stuff in the New York Times and the Chronicle of Higher Ed about students complaining that, oh, my teachers just lecture all the time and I don't learn anything from lectures. My point here is not to necessarily say that the print textbooks and lectures are bad or that they're not effective learning methods, because, you know, my goodness, all of us on this call, that's the way we all learned. And my entire career has been dedicated to presenting and giving lectures like I am right now, and reading and editing and writing books. So I don't mean to be dismissive or just imply that these things are bad, but that simply that they are kind of misunderstood and that we're taking the part for the whole. And I would make an analogy to say that, thinking of print books and lectures as the only way people learn is just limiting. It's like, think of it like trying to perform a symphony using two instruments. You're only hearing some of the notes. You're only hearing part of the story. So part of the learning science model is to increase your repertoire and broaden the way that you use learning, so that many students today learn in other ways, and we need to accommodate and understand what that looks like. So one of the people that has been most instrumental and has really helped me to understand this is Richard Mayer. Richard E. Mayer, that's a picture of him there on the screen. He has spent pretty much his entire career in academia. He teaches at UC Santa Barbara and lectures all over the world. He's tried to answer this question: how can we help people learn in ways so that they can take what they've learned and apply it to new situations? So this is the classic problem of transfer, right? Your student is in your class. Are they going to retain it long enough to pass the test and then forget? Or are they going to remember it 5 months, 5 weeks, 5 years down the road, and to be able to actually apply it in the next class and maybe in their future life and in their career? So he's trying to address the classic problem of learning transference and to figure out what are ways that we can design learning experiences that work better. Now, what Mayer argues is that the implicit theory of learning is that learning is a single channel, unlimited capacity, passive processing activity. So single channel meaning verbal. Unlimited capacity meaning we think people can sit and listen for 50 minutes at a time and absorb 50 minutes worth of material. We have an unlimited view of their working short-term memory. And we view learning as passive, that the student basically learns by absorbing, or like a sponge, right? The classic blank slate model of the student learner. So he says this is the implicit model of learning that's baked into most of our teaching and learning in higher ed today. But he contrasts that with what he calls the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, which is based on 3 basic assumptions about how the human mind works, namely that the human mind is dual channel, limited capacity, and active processing. So let me just break that down for a minute. And as opposed to single channel, he says the human mind is dual channel. And those 2 channels are verbal and visual. And in fact, we also have eyes and ears. And as you see on the screen right now and are listening to me, you're seeing both words and pictures using both your ears and your eyes. So the 2 channels are, it's not just visual verbal, because verbal crosses the channel, but the point is that the human mind is constantly working to integrate visual and verbal information. It's 2 channel, not 1. It has a limited capacity. Short-term working memory is short. You have already forgotten where we started 10 or 15 minutes ago. Basically, the research says the short-term memory is 5 to 8 minutes long. After 5 to 8 minutes, the stuff that you heard 5 to 8 minutes ago starts to fall out the other end. You've got a stack overload. Your buffer is full. So the human short-term working memory is limited and quite short. And that the processing system that learners use is active. You have to make sense of it by relating the new information to what you already know. So he says, in contrast to that implicit model, we have instead a dual channel, limited capacity, active processing system. So I promise that's as technical as we're going to get. So what does that mean for us, right? What does that mean for us as textbook authors, textbook editors, designers, and students? Well, I think there are 3 primary implications of Mayer's cognitive theory. The first one is that if we are dual channel learners, then the implication is we should use visuals and words in combination. If short-term memory is limited, then the implication is that we should deliver content in pretty small and focused chunks, right? And active processing, if we are active learners, not passive learners, then the solution or the implication is that we should give learners ample opportunities to process and make sense of incoming material. It's not that complicated. I mean, that's what I'm saying. These principles are relatively simple. The execution is the hard part. So in the rest of the time, I want to take these ideas and show you what I think they might look like in practice, beginning with this idea of backward design. So backward design, as you can probably guess, is the process of beginning at the end. So in backward design, you begin by thinking in terms of learning goals and outcomes. What does the student need to know or be able to do? Now you can apply this question to an entire book, an entire course, or to individual chapters or individual units, ideally you define overall learning goals first and then break them down into chapters or unit goals. So one of the people that I have found really helpful is this woman named Julie Dirksen, and she wrote a book called Design How People Learn. It's not specifically focused on higher ed. It's more kind of corporate e-learning that she's focused on, but I think a lot of the principles apply to us. And what Dirksen does is she encourages us to view learning as a kind of journey. And so our goal as teachers and textbook designers and writers is to help that learner go from the current state to this awesome future learner state. And in the middle, there's probably some gaps. So backward design is about identifying those gaps. You know, what is between where that student is now and where we want that student to be at the end of this lesson, at the end of this chapter, or at the end of this course. So there are really two primary types of learning gaps that we are concerned with. There are knowledge gaps and there are skills gaps. The student might need to learn something new. They might need a concept, they might need a term, they might need a definition, or they might need to practice a skill to get across that gap. And so what we try to do is figure out what is the gap and how do we help that learner get across. And that's where the backward design principle comes into play. And the primary tool in the toolkit for this is the good old learning objective or learning outcome. Now, some of you may already are probably in the position now of being encouraged by your department chair, your university administration, or your editor to think in terms of learning outcomes and learning objectives. I know most of the courses I teach now, I am accountable for demonstrating that I have met these learning outcomes. So there's been a lot of talk about learning outcomes, and like many people, I resisted them at first. I saw them as somehow reductive, but I've worked with it for a long time now, and I've really come around to thinking that this is a pretty useful theory and a useful process for developing and designing content, whether it's an e-learning course, an online course at a university, or a textbook. And it begins by asking this question: what does the student need to know or be able to do at the end of this unit? And to me, the reason why this is so powerful is that it represents a shift in perspective. So instead of thinking, what do I need to cover in this unit? Instead of thinking about the content, all of a sudden we're thinking about the learner. What does she need to know? What does she need to be able to do? And so we've shifted our perspective from content-focused to learner-focused, and I think that's very important. Now, to assess whether your learning outcome is effective, there's a kind of a three-part test. It needs to be observable, accessible, and doable. You need to be able to see it. You need to be able to assess it to know if the student can do it or not, and it needs to actually be doable, meaning that the student needs to actually be able to achieve the goal that or the outcome that you have suggested for them. And you'd be surprised, or maybe not, at how many textbook exercises and activities do not meet the achievability criteria. They're not actually doable because they're simply either too hard or they're not clearly defined. So I've worked with a lot of authors over the years to try to help them make more achievable and doable. So let's take a look at an example. So let's say I'm working with an author who's writing a textbook on writing. It's a rhetoric textbook for a first-year composition course. And this topic, we're actually working on a chapter on the topic of rhetorical analysis. It's a typical assignment in a Comp 1 course. You assign a student to write a rhetorical analysis of a verbal or visual text. So I go to the author and I say, tell me what the learning outcome is for this chapter. And so his initial draft comes back something like this. Well, my learning outcome for this chapter is understand the different types of rhetorical appeals and apply them to the process of writing a rhetorical analysis. Not bad, right? I mean, pretty good start. It tells us at least we've shifted to the learner perspective, but let's run it through the test. Does it pass the test? Is this observable? Well, look at that word understand. Can you observe understanding? I mean, does a light bulb physically appear over the student's head? Do their eyes light up? I mean, maybe in a face-to-face class you can kind of tell, but generally no. It's not really observable. You can't see understanding. It's cognitive and it's internal. So understand might not be the best word there. Is it accessible? This learning outcome is partially accessible if you want to focus on a student writing a rhetorical analysis, and you could assign them to write such a paper and then evaluate that paper, and you would know how much of this learning they had absorbed. But the steps to get there in the middle are not really well defined. And is this achievable or doable? I would say not really. I would say this really asks too much and assumes too much prior knowledge, at least at the beginning of a chapter and the beginning of a book. But it's a start. And this is typically what first draft learning outcomes look like. And I do them the same way. I mean, I start with a big kind of, I call it lumpy batter. I start with a big lumpy batter. And then what I like to do is I refer to this document, and it's included in your takeaway handout. It's a list of verbs based on Benjamin Bloom's famous taxonomy of learning. It's simply a list of verbs. It's a list of words. But these words are all active verbs that represent accessible things. So what I do is break this down using this backward design concept and sort of take the original lumpy batter outcomes and break it down into a series of smaller, more manageable ones. So assuming that we've just spent 15 minutes in a workshop, we might come up with a list that looks like this. Define ethos, define pathos, and define logos. Those are the three types of rhetorical appeals. So before a student understands them, they have to know what they are. So first we define, then we explain the differences between them, then we identify examples of each, then we describe how they're used in the text, classify different types of rhetorical appeals, analyze the ways a text makes use of those, and compose an essay. So notice the verbs: define, explain, identify, describe, classify, analyze, compose. Active, accessible verbs. So two things have happened in going through this process. And obviously it takes some work and it takes some practice to get here. But we've done two things. We've shifted from a content-centered model to a learner-centered model. And in the process of doing this, we've indirectly developed a pretty detailed outline for a chapter. I mean, I look at this and I go, there's 11 A heads right there, we're done. We've got the whole chapter outlined. And the lesson from this is really based on backward design and learning outcomes. Less is more. Don't try to cover too much. It's better to focus on a select few very incremental learning goals in each chapter. So we've worked backwards from the end goals to plan and design our content. So that's kind of a snapshot of what we're talking about by backward design. And again, you can apply this principle from this macro level to the micro level, from a whole book to individual chapters to sections within chapters. The second design strategy is what we call modularity. And this picks up where backward design leaves off. So once we've identified that working list of learning outcomes, whether it's 5 or 7 or 11 or what have you, now we can begin to design short chunks of content to address each one of those. And here's where I've really been helped by a pretty new book by a fellow named James Lang called Small Teaching: Everyday Lessons from the Science of Learning. It's a fantastic book. It's totally a toolkit for whether you teach online or face-to-face or you write textbooks. I think it's totally, go get this book. It's really awesome and wonderful. And what he talks about is this concept of small teaching, an approach that seeks to spark positive change in higher education through small but powerful modifications in our course design and teaching practices. And he really talks a lot about this, breaking that stuff down into little five-minute mini lessons, or what he almost calls micro lessons. And let's think about how we might use some of these principles then with our model textbook chapter. So here's what we might see as a visual map of a typical textbook chapter. This is an outline that follows the established conventions of textbook design. Most of the draft chapters that I see from authors look kind of like this. It's a pretty tried and true paradigm. You begin with an introduction, then you have the 3 green sections that represent concept A, concept B, and concept C. You're defining the terms, defining the concepts that the student needs to know. Then you have some kind of a case study, an extended example. Then we have applications where we have either more examples or additional case studies or maybe some shorter illustrations to kind of flesh out the concepts. And then at the end of the chapter, we have that familiar end of chapter pedagogy, right? Where you have review questions, quiz questions, short writing activities, discussion questions, all the package of stuff that you usually see at the end where the students now apply what they've learned in that chapter. So what happens if we go from traditional design to modular design? Well, here's what happens. You can see this contrasting model. So the model that I propose based on learning theory is different. And you can see, first of all, the beginning is kind of the same. We start with an introduction that lays out the learning objectives for the chapter and tells the student, here's where you need to go, here's what you're supposed to learn by the end of this chapter. And then one of the biggest changes is that case study moves front and center. We put it to the front. It's almost the first thing in the chapter. Dive into an example. And the reason that I argue for this model is because students need concrete examples. Undergraduate college students really struggle with abstract concepts. It helps them a lot to start with the case study, and you can ask some preliminary questions. You know, you can read the case study and then immediately follow it with some activities. What do you think? How do you expect that this case study might have been resolved? What do you understand and anticipate about that? And so you give the student a concrete example first, and you get them actively thinking about it and doing some work. There's that engagement, the cognitive engagement or interactive part. And then you say, all right, let's look at concept A. Here's a new term. Let's say it's ethos in the world of rhetoric, ethos, a particular kind of rhetorical appeal. Now you start defining the terms, and you can refer back to the case study. Then you go right back into applications again and activities and assignments. So you have this modular cycle where it's a new idea, practice, engage, new idea, practice, engage. As some of my friends like to say, read a little, do a little, read a little, do a little, read a little, do a little. So on the left, the traditional model, you have to do a whole bunch of work before you get to the end. And on the right, you're doing more integrated work throughout that chapter, and you're much, much more likely to remember and be able to access and apply some of those concepts later on. So that's really the essence of modular design. Now, I'm sure many of you are already doing stuff like this and maybe designing chapters that look like this. So I'd be interested to hear if that is your experience, if you're moving toward this more chunky kind of modular approach. Does it require massive rewriting? Not necessarily. And a lot of this is cut and paste. I mean, literally, you take that case study and you copy paste it and move it to the front of the chapter and kind of turn the structure upside down. It's some of the same concept and the same content. It's just rearranging it in a different way. So that's the essence of what we're calling modularity. Now, the third leg of the design tripod, or the third concept, is this multimedia thing. And of course, that could be a whole webinar and a whole series of webinars unto itself. But we'll go back to our friend Richard Mayer. And this is the backbone, the foundation of the multimedia principle. People can learn more deeply from words and pictures than from words alone. That's why I'm putting visuals on the screen for you right now, because I think it would be far more effective than it would if you were just listening to my voice. People learn more deeply from words and pictures than from words alone. So how do we apply this principle to textbooks? Well, I start by asking authors questions like this to get them thinking about creating a multimodal or multimedia learning experience. I say, well, are there places we can identify where running text might be converted to a table, to a chart, to a figure, or to a photo? Are there places in the chapter where a discussion might work better as an animation, or a little video, or an audio podcast? If we have those available to us, can we use digital media in some way to bring that content to life and illustrate a process or show something rather than telling it? And can students access the material using those different modalities, audio, visual, and verbal? That makes it far more accessible, for one thing, both in terms of learning styles and in terms of students with disabilities. So I pose these questions to authors and get them thinking about it. And sometimes I like to use an activity that I call the storyboard project. I don't know if any of you are familiar with a writer named Dan Roam, R-O-A-M, like roam around the world. He's a big into this visual thinking, and he goes around and does these workshops called the back of the napkin. And I sort of stole this idea from Dan Roam. And the idea is, put your keyboard down and pick up a Sharpie and a blank piece of white paper and draw me a picture. How can you teach this concept using a visual instead of words? And for verbal people like us, sometimes we feel really silly. I'm not an artist, but it really challenges you to really rethink concepts in a visual way, and it's quite useful. So we start with these kinds of questions, have some conversations with the authors and tease out some visual ideas. And then there are some fairly simple things you can do. I'm just going to show you two examples. Again, these are not high tech, these are print book examples. Going back to that same textbook, the first year writing textbook, this is something that was originally 4 pages of running text, and we converted it to a 1-page infographic. Some people felt it looked a little babyish or a little crude or a little cartoonish, and we thought that's okay. We want it to be playful and not too intimidating for students. It's called The Road to a Strong Thesis. The idea here was that we wanted to help students understand how you get to your thesis. Students know a thesis statement is a really important thing to have in a piece of writing, and they have no idea how to make one. So we wanted to illustrate the process that an actual student used to come up with her thesis. So it's a literal roadmap. It begins with the assignment, that little yellow box in the lower left, assignment to write an analytical essay. And then it walks visually and verbally through that roadmap, where she's questioning and having second thoughts. So all of the blue boxes represent her internal dialogue with herself to lead to the final thesis over in the red box at the destination point there, where she comes up with her thesis statement in response to that original assignment prompt. So again, this is not really a super fancy or complicated visual, but it's much more effective, we found, than simply describing her process in 4 pages of running text. Obviously, it's more efficient. You can kind of grasp it all at once. And on a more practical level, sales reps love this because this is something they can flip open when they're in a meeting with a faculty member and point to it and say, look at this, we have this neat new visual element called the road to a strong thesis, and it appears in every chapter. So there are sort of self-serving strategic reasons to do flashy little visual things like this as well. And a second example from that same book, the same concept of the sort of the thought map, the road map. And this is the process that starts at the bottom or the foreground and moves toward the top or the background to try to describe this process of mapping your situation. This book is called Writing Situations, and it's about, as a writer, you need to understand the situation you're in. Who is your audience? Who is the context? And that sort of thing. And that's a very, very abstract concept for many college students. They really have a hard time grasping that idea that they're not just writing for their teacher. So we wanted to help them see that process, and this is the visual that we came up with. So again, a fairly simple kind of infographic that works, takes a process that's primarily text-based and makes it more visual. And with what we could do with digitally on the website with this is actually animate this. So these do on the Pearson My Writing Lab and things like that, these can be animated and brought to life, and students can actually work through them as an activity. That doesn't work on the print book, but we were building the foundation for materials that would also work in an online sort of moving digital context. So those are the 3 principles, and what I think is powerful about them is that when you pull them all together, they actually work as a 3-step process. Step 1 is backward design. You define your learning outcomes and then design backward to identify those granular chapter outcomes and activities. Step 2 is you arrange those granular activities and outcomes into some kind of a learning path, interleaving opportunities for students to review, practice, and lots of repetition. And then you add in the multimedia, that layer in the visual and digital elements to use visual, verbal, and audio channels. So that's an effect of how you might pull all 3 of these back together to begin thinking about work on your own books. And I'm assuming some of you work with some of the major publishers like Pearson and McGraw-Hill and Cengage, and they have all designed these new digital platforms that are basically built around this kind of a model. Pearson has a thing called Revel, R-E-V-E-L. McGraw-Hill has a system called Connect, and Cengage has MindCap. They're all different in some ways, but they're based on this kind of a model and this kind of a principle. So what I think is useful is that thinking this way and beginning to apply these concepts will really put you in a better position to be able to integrate your content and work more directly with those ebook and digital teams to be able to advise them. Because usually what happens, to be honest, is most authors are pretty hands-off. And so they finish the book and then they hand it off to the ebook team and the production team, and they bring in third-party vendors. And those third-party vendors are really good with technology. They're also not teachers, and they're not subject matter experts. And so the technology and the videos enhancements in those platforms end up being not as good as your book. So I encourage you as the subject matter expert and the teacher and the expert in your book to get more involved and to try to work collaboratively with your digital production team to bring your content to life in those platforms. You will be able to do it better, and they will be able to do it better with you than if you just finish the print book and let them do it themselves. So that's my little encouragement for that. So I want to end then by talking briefly about mobile. Mobile is kind of the next frontier of this, and students are showing up on campus increasingly every year wanting to use mobile phones to access their course content. And so I've been thinking about how might we design text materials that work on a phone. Even though I know for many of us who are getting up in the years, we think, how could you possibly read content on your phone? It's so small. The point is they do, overwhelmingly. So a mobile-first design philosophy has become dominant in web design. So how can we apply that to our own work? Now here's one example. This is a new startup company called Gadget Software, and they've actually designed a publishing platform specifically for higher education textbooks on mobile. I've just started working with them. I'm kind of helping them to design and develop the platform for this. I don't know yet. I can't make any promises about if it's going to be great or not, but it has a heck of a lot of promising potential, and it allows you to do a lot of things to design your content around those modularity and the backward design principles, and design it so that it actually works well on a phone. If you've ever tried an experiment, pick up your smartphone and go to your own textbook, ebook, or website if you have one, and see how it looks. It's usually not a very good experience, because what they usually do is take the print book pages and turn them into static PDF files that look super tiny. So there's a lot of back-end engineering work and design work that needs to be done, but Gadget is one of these companies that has really developed a promising new platform. And what they add into something that we haven't talked about before, and what I think is exciting, is this notion of location awareness. So you can see on the screenshot here, the phone actually knows where you are in real space. In this case, the phone recognizes we are in Morristown, New Jersey. And an alert pops up that says, did you know that the electric telegraph was invented in Morristown, New Jersey? You can thank Samuel Morse. And if you click Show Me, it gives you some additional stories about what happened in Morristown and who is Samuel Morse. And so it's almost like Pokemon Go for educational content. It's that augmented reality concept where the student is exploring both physical space and digital space at the same time, and they're learning about a location. So think about, museums, archaeology, history, science. If you're in a lab, I mean, all the ways that you could be delivering content to a student that's pinging them based on where they actually are. They might be taking a tour of Jamestown, Virginia, and getting content that's telling them things about the history of the space where they're actually standing at that point in time. To me, it's mind-boggling and just incredibly powerful to think about how that augmented reality might work. So that's kind of 5 years out, but 5 years will go pretty fast. And I think people like Gadget and some of these other companies are really onto something when they're thinking in terms of mobile first. But to conclude, I wanted to show you an example and put my own work in front of you to show you that I really do practice what I preach. I teach an online undergraduate tech writing course, and as an experiment, I've been using Weebly. Weebly is one of those free website builders. There's one called Wix. There are several that are out there. There's WordPress, of course, and they have these responsive drag and drop website builders where you can design content that actually looks pretty good on a phone. So I've tried to do that with the material for my tech writing course. And this is a 1-minute video clip that just gives you a kind of visual tour. So here's the home page. There's some about the course material. I apologize for the rapid scrolling. I know that you can't read that. There's the course textbook. There's me, and there's this Get Started button. Student clicks the Get Started button, and here's these 3 videos that are basically first day of class. What is the course overview? What are we doing? What are the expectations? Keys to success, basically how to survive in an online class. And then here's what the assignments look like. To be modular, I sort of broke it down week by week. And so here's a typical week. You have the learning goals at the top, a little overview about what are we doing this week. And this happens to be a week we were talking about writing process, how to break an assignment down into steps. There's another video, the assignments, what they needed to do in that particular week, sort of a tutorial on how to write a statement of purpose. Here's a couple of readings. So that reading, see, that's a PDF, so to see how tiny that looks, that does not work very well. But this is my attempt to sort of pull this all together and use this backwards multimodal modular type of design for my own course. And if you want to go visit this is an open public website. You can just go to technicalwritingonline.net. There's no confidential student information there. The students are using Blackboard for that kind of stuff, so you won't see anything that you shouldn't see, but you're welcome to take a tour and just take a look. And Weebly is not that hard to use. And it's an interesting practice to kind of sit here with my phone and develop some content and then say, is that too much text? Am I expecting them to read too much? But that's how it kind of looks when you put all those things together. So that is basically my spiel. I know I covered a lot. I know we went pretty fast, but it looks like we have about 15 minutes left for questions and answers. So I welcome any questions. I guess Becky can take questions from the chat window and relay them to me, and I can do my best to answer them. Thank you very much. I've had a good time, and I hope you got something out of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. We do now have time for some questions. Please type your question in the question box on your screen. I will be sharing your questions in order as they are received. And we already do have a few questions. I will start with this first one here. Where do you think the market is in terms of digital interactive learning? Are systems like Revel already widely used? Do you think that they will at some point replace their current model of printed books, supplemented by online videos, etc.? Or will people always prefer a real book in their hands?
That's the $64,000 question. But what I can tell you, what I know is that Pearson passed the point about 5 years ago where they were making their revenue was more than 50% digital. So the publishers, frankly, to be honest, the big publishers, they cannot phase out print fast enough. They're racing to all digital. Because that's their business model and that's what's working for them. We all know the problems with the used textbook market, and it hits our bottom line in our back pocket pretty directly. So I think the big publishers that are on the cutting edge of this are moving very fast to digital. When you ask students, many students still prefer print. And I think I love print myself. You know, I read a lot of stuff on screen and I read a lot of stuff on print. So I think we are in, if you really want my opinion, we're in a period now where for the next 5-10 years, print and digital will coexist. And so the challenge is to think of what works well in print, what works well in digital. And my ideal model is a hybrid where you have a short print book with some of the core content that students can read and absorb in that format, sample papers, for example, for my tech writing course. That's why I use a print textbook from Oxford University Press, supplemented with online stuff. I think that's a pretty great model. It works really well for me. And so my preferred model is a hybrid with both and. It really depends. Smaller publishers don't have the resources that the big one has to develop those platforms. But, you know, your experience may vary on that.
All right, we have another question. In the learning objective part, you went from 1 learning objective to a total of 11. They're small, but do you think that's too many?
Yes, I think that's too many. I think the ideal, honestly, I aim for chapters that are about 5. I think in that case, what I would have done at that point when I saw 11, I would go back to the author and say, I think we should break this into 2 chapters. One which would be on understanding rhetorical appeals, and a second chapter that would be on writing a rhetorical analysis. So I think 11 is way too many. 5 is my secret ideal number. No more than 7 at the most.
All right, here's another one. This is really great content. I appreciated the tip about providing the sales reps something that helps market the book. Do you have any other examples of that?
Lots of, anytime you, those, in the examples that I showed from, I can go back and show you. Sales reps like things that they can literally point to, and they loved these spreads. I mean, the nice thing about the DK handbook was it had a story that worked for the rep. So we could say, we have designed the content in spreads. They could point to the 2-page spread. We could say, we have designed the content in layers, and they could show the professors. And we could say, we have used these pattern models. I think anytime you can have something that is sort of pretty and flashy and fits on a 1 or 2-page spread, and you can tell a story about it, you know, because we did the user testing in this handbook, the story of we tested on real students became the story of the book, and we had student testimonials and all that. So we really milked it. We milked it for all it was worth. It did work. I mean, this handbook sold extremely well, and you can see from my cover image, it went into its 4th edition. So it did great. I mean, we succeeded and won a bunch of awards and fun stuff like that. But the example is anything that you can point to in 1 or 2 places, because, you know, sales reps' time and attention is very, very, very precious. And often they don't get much faculty mind share. So if they can point to something visual like this, I think that's a great way to get in the door and get a book in front of people.
All right. We still have a few minutes for questions. If you have any other questions, you can type them in the box right now. I just had one comment here. Nice webinar, great stuff. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
And this one, it might be a little repetitive, but what is your personal thought about print versus e-textbook?
Uh, we need both. I mean, I think that some students learn better. I have a lot of students who really, really prefer print books and are quite resistant to online learning because they just say they don't retain it as well. So sorry to scroll through this. I was going to make sure that my email address showed up. I think we need both at this point, and we are probably. It seems like the market generally in both trade and text publishing has stabilized to where um, people are coexisting and using both print and digital. I don't think it's a contest either or a battle that one will necessarily win over the other. I think we will settle into a pattern where we know better how people are using the different mediums and what works well in print as opposed to what works well in digital. Um, I actually teach a course that's all focused on that. It's called The Technology of the Book, and we really look at the history of print. And one of the things that people don't know is that textbooks, at least in Western Europe, the genre of the textbook predates the printing press. The printing press was invented in Germany in 1450. There was a huge market for textbooks, and particularly in places like Paris, where you have the Sorbonne. They were handwritten, handwritten scribes, and students were pirating textbooks in the 12th and 13th centuries. They would go buy one copy, and then they would sit in their dorms, or whatever the equivalent was of a dorm in the 12th century, and they would write them out like the monastic scribes and sell them to each other. So there was a thriving textbook market before Gutenberg. I thought that was kind of a fascinating, footnote on the history of printing. But there are so many different models for what an ebook looks like. And what's interesting for me in giving this presentation and writing the script for this was thinking, am I talking about a book or am I talking about a course? Kind of both, right? I mean, I think textbook design and course design are merging. And a textbook has always supported a course, and we've known faculty like to build their syllabi around their textbooks, and many textbooks have 15 or 16 chapters so that it's easy to do that. But they're beginning to merge even more. So you have something that might be an ebook, it might be a website, it might be enhanced e-text with, who knows what, it might be called a lab, but it's all basically doing the same thing, delivering that content to the student. But I think, if there's one takeaway that from what I've been learning, it's that we know precious little about students. We are really good at adapting to faculty needs and really, really terrible at adapting to student needs. And, think about your own experience. Have you ever tested your materials on students? Maybe you have, and I think we all should. We should do a heck of a lot more of that. We should be doing a lot more usability testing and class testing our materials and really engaging in a dialogue with our students to make sure, does this work for you? Are you learning this material, or are you struggling with it? And that's where I think the usability testing and reading stuff in user experience design and web design is really helpful for textbook authors and for teachers as well.
All right, looks like there is another question. I am interested in your personal model preference: shorter print text with key content complemented by electronic content. Are the major publishers favoring that model, or are they pushing all the way toward all e-content?
The major publishers are pushing all the way toward e-content, but at this point, I know that instructors have a choice. If, for example, they're using the Pearson Revel platform, they can either buy the Revel by itself, or they can buy the Revel plus the print book. Of course, that costs more for the students. The big publishers are pushing more toward a fully digital model, but there are a lot of smaller, innovative companies that I think are doing both and making ebooks available. And as a teacher, I'm a huge fan of open source materials because it's free for students, and there are a lot of really good ebooks that are available out there that are mostly like a print reading experience, mostly text. So there are ways that you can kind of customize a package for your students that meets that hybrid model. It takes some work to do it. So a lot of teachers, particularly if you're teaching a heavy load, you tend to just default to whatever package the publisher gives you. And, they're quite obviously intentionally pushing toward the all digital model.
All right, it looks like there aren't any other questions. If you have not done so already, I encourage you to register for the 10 Habits of Highly Productive Academic Writers, which will be held on September 27th from 1 to 2 p.m. If you missed any of TAA's past webinars, you can watch them in the Library of Presentations on Demand on the TAA website. You can find the link under the Resources tab. Thank you, Michael, for sharing your expertise with us today, and thank you all for participating in the presentation.
Thanks, everyone.